See an additional face on the screen with me, and I'd like to introduce my colleague, Josh Johnson, representing American Institute of Architects, Wisconsin. Hi, Josh. A few words about him. Josh is a senior architect at ADCI, a firm with offices in Lake Delton and Madison. He is quite a volunteer. His volunteer work for the American Institute of Architects over the last 30 years, you're dating yourself, Josh, and with Monona Terrace over the last 20, has included arranging over 100 lectures in the Madison area and now virtually for literally an international audience. He also has introduced thousands of elementary age children to architecture and urban design in the classroom through a program called Terrace Town. I do think it's thousands. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Josh.
Thank you, Heather, very much. We certainly love working with you on this program, and Monona Terrace has always been an absolutely fabulous partner. So thanks very much for everything you do. Tonight, we're really pleased to have Tom Kundig and speaking with. Tom's one of the foremost architects in the country, and I absolutely have had so much respect for him for so long, and so many people have. He has a National Design Award from the Cooper Hewitt, and also the Academy of Arts and Letters gave him a National Design Award, and I can see a few more coming his way because the firm and Tom's work and the firm's work has just been absolutely fabulous. Our clients tend to like to ask us to create something that's authentic and create a level of authenticity. And it's often, it's a hard conversation because we're creating something brand new. And what they're really describing is the work of Tom's firm and Tom's work in particular, where it just feels authentic right from the get-go, right from the very beginning. And a bunch of years ago, I worked in New York City, and my boss told me that James Indigo Freed, I asked about him, and he said, well, he's the gentleman architect. He's the one that everybody respects in New York City. Everyone has respect for his work and respect for his personality. And that was prior to Mr. Freed doing the Holocaust Museum. And I think the national level that Tom has taken on that mantle, people really respect him from a professional and from a personal standpoint. And it's just, I think we've got a lot of friends here and a bunch that you haven't met yet, Tom, but they're friends of yours that are here to watch. So without any further ado, I want to welcome you to our lecture series and have fun.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks, Heather. Yeah, and hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this next hour. Heather said we have some questions following this little presentation. It literally is a short presentation, and I've been doing this for probably 15, maybe even more years. Is opening it up to questions and hopefully answers for you that make some sense based on my career and then the office's evolution over the last 30, I think it's 33 years, 34 years that I've been with Jim Olson, who founded the firm 50 years ago. So that's the context of the firm. And I think a lot of you that are a similar generation to me will recognize the sort of evolution of a relatively small firm growing into a large firm. And there are a lot of reasons for that happening. And I want to go into that a little bit. And sometimes my lecture, it's not really a lecture, it's the question and answers. It's my early presentation of some of the influences that were impactful to my career that are particularly important, I think, to students and young architects, because I think those of you of similar generation to me know how frustrating the profession can be on any number of levels, but ultimately I think we all agree it truly is one of the most, I think, valuable professions personally on so many levels, both from the tectonic to the personal, of course, dealing with clients and community groups, culture, et cetera. So what I'd like to do is just quickly start with a little description of where we are now, get into a little bit of my history with some of the, again, the impacts or the influences, I should say, that impacted my career, that are my sort of personal basis for making decisions, design decisions, compatriot decisions, colleague decisions, all of those sort of very important decisions we make throughout our career. The first slide here is basically our entry sequence into the office. The time lapse is something that we hold very important to the firm. As you all know, the firm is one of the very few places where you have this colleague discussions and collaborations where you can experiment, where you can think, where you can grow, you can mature. And that certainly has been the case here. So what we did when we moved into the space, I think now it's close to 20 years ago, we saw the entry sequence as one of the most important places where we could kind of say something about the DNA of the firm. So this is where we have our research and development project. You can see the skylight opens and closes. That's actually our ventilation system, our natural ventilation system, and our daylighting system, our reflected daylighting system, fatigue lights, daylighting down into the lower floors. That's intentional, that's measured. The system itself is to raise and lower that 300-pound skylight is actually run off the city water pressure. So at this level of the building, it's about 38 pounds per square inch. And basically those are custom and craft. Of course, it's very important to this office. So there's custom designed valves and systems and pumps basically, or not pumps, but cylinders to basically lift 300 pounds of glass and steel. And it's the center, it's basically the center of the office. It's the crossroads of the office. And of course, and we've been all impacted, you know, with the pandemic where we've been working remotely. And I think we've all discovered, maybe rediscovered how important that, that colleague interaction, how important that is to basically understanding and producing terrific work. I think there were a couple of tough years for us, and I think we can all, and hopefully some of your questions revolve around the last couple of years and the impact it's had on us delivering superior work, which is the DNA of the firm. We started about 33 years ago when I started in the firm. I always tell the story, we were 12 people when I joined the firm, and within a week we were 7 people. So things are really not looking great for the firm in general. But Jim and Rick at that point, Olson Kundig, invested in the firm and felt about the potential of the firm, and were willing to risk their investment. And we were, as a staff, risked our time, frankly, to invest in what we thought was a future that we could all collectively experience. So since then, over the years, over the 33 years, we've grown from the sort of the nadir at 7 to about 250, I think, at this point, maybe 260. I'm not even sure. That culturally has changed us all. The delivery of projects, of course, are much, much different. And we can talk a little bit about that and how important that is to the firm. The main point I want to make about the firm is we are more of an old school, tradition-based firm where there has been the understanding and the belief that an architect is really an architect when they go from the scribbles, the early drawings, the conceptual drawings, the meeting with the clients, all the way through all the technical developments, construction documents, and then ultimately the construction administration, and then the post-construction phases of a project. So we truly understand how a building ends up is really important, how it starts, and vice versa. So if you understand how a building ends, you can actually have more informed scribbles at the beginning of the project. And we've always held that philosophy important to the culture of the firm. That's being stressed right now, and happy to answer any questions on that when you come to the size of about 260 people, if that makes sense. We're in the Pacific Northwest. We're on the wet side of the mountains. That's hugely impactful for our area and our architecture initially, because of course we were mostly working local. But Washington is actually a fascinating state because in fact, there's a very dry side and a very high side, a mountainous side to Washington State. I think it has all 7 environmental environmental conditions in the state, within the state borders. I actually grew up on the east side. I grew up on the dry side. That's eastern Washington, northern Idaho, and southern British Columbia and southern Alberta. That was my zone of influence. And that really is a land of big landscape. And that had huge impact on my understanding of what architecture really is, the context of architecture. It put me in a sense that into a scale of architecture where architecture fits in these large landscapes. In other words, architecture is a small part of the big, larger landscape. And even though all the photographs of the architecture that you're going to be seeing on our loop during the question and answer part of this, obviously the building's always in the middle. The idea is that the building really, in reality, which is really how you experience architecture, is really a small part of the larger landscape. That when you do visit these projects, you can recognize that no, architecture takes a backseat to the context of the place. And the context of the place could be an urban center like New York City or Los Angeles. That's context. It's all about the context, we think. And the architecture takes a small part in that larger context. This is literally the landscape outside my hometown of Spokane, Washington, where it's a large landscape. It's an overwhelming landscape, but it's a landscape of nuance. And I think I learned even as a kid, before I even wanted to be an architect, that it's not just about the big ideas. It's not just about the big moves and the big overwhelming, almost Wagnerian kind of climates and landscapes. It's also about the very, very small, beautiful nuances that balance that experience. And hopefully the architecture does exactly that. It's about the big moves and it's about the landscape. I also grew up during an infrastructure couple of decades that were super important, the 60s and the 70s, devastating to our environment, but actually really interesting to a kid growing up in this environment, where our ancestors learned how to use existing physics, existing hydrology, existing situations to make very large pieces into small pieces. As a kid, always found that really interesting. Never felt that I was going to be part of it, but just found it frankly fascinating. I have a Swiss heritage, and because of that, the mountains were really important to the family. I was lucky to be in a place where I could really engage the mountains. I think the mountain climbing years of my youth, the 20s and the 30s, were probably the most impactful in the sense of how do you engage a natural situation, an uncertain situation, an unpredictable situation, using physics, using tools, and using your physical talents or your physical limitations and understanding those risks and those opportunities. I still look back on these days as the years I learned how to be, if this makes sense, how to be disciplined. It was not about getting to the top. It was about how you got to the top. How you got to the top in terms of elegance of the route, elegance of the solution, and then of course the return. So that was he took kind of a knucklehead 16-year-old and through the years until my mid-30s, changed my life around. It was very important to understand how also to practice architecture. Again, the impact of your youth experiences and how they impact your practice in your life, your mature life. And I was lucky, again, also, not only lucky to be in the mountains, but back in the cities. They were the years of hot rod building hot rods in everybody's garage. I think our family was the only family that did not have a hot rod in the garage, but everybody around us did. I sort of learned that, you know, something like a commodity could be taken and turned into something very personal, hopefully something beautiful, but most importantly, personal, like what an artist does. An artist picks up something, manipulates it in a very personal way. Sometimes hot rodding is seen as lowbrow art. I actually grew up with an artist that called it highbrow art because it was about the person. Upper right is exactly what I think Harold meant. We'll talk about Harold here in a second. But that's a fountain in Basel, Switzerland by Jean Tinguely, who obviously was one of the premier artists of the 60s, the 50s and the 60s. And he's using auto parts, machine parts to make high art. And again, it's a reference, it's an understanding that we all are artists if we take something that's the usual and we turn it into something that's special to us and special to other people. Hugely important to our architecture. Sort of understand how you can take a commodity and manipulate it in a way to make it something more than a reinvented commodity. A number of years I found going to Bonneville and just watching the streamliners and the hot rodders race. It was all very fascinating, loud, and sort of exciting, but I found the most interesting part was what people would do with their machinery and the beautiful things that they would make based on the function of the idea of going fast. So I would probably argue that maybe most of the people that worked on this streamliner didn't know they were necessarily making something beautiful. They may have recognized it as something beautiful, but they solved the issue and something beautiful came out of it. And I think we all know that that's, I think, the basis of a true, as Josh says, authentic architecture is understanding the problem and making it and solving it in an efficient, disciplined way, and something beautiful emerges out of that very special situation. I think, again, something I just learned, was lucky to learn, just observing people working on their vehicles. Also, and you know, sometimes I'll say, oh, and I look back on my life and I think, ooh, well, that was kind of lucky that I was actually around some really terrific artists. Not everybody always is, but I'm convinced that you can gather, you can harvest terrific ideas, impactful ideas, generally as a kid to young adult, and that will carry you through your career. I know that's been the case for me in all of my, I can just recognize those decisions are so rooted in my youth. Lower left, that's Ed and Nancy Keenholz. Really did some really weird stuff as artists. Again, as a kid growing up, I just thought, well, that's what an artist does. I'm not an artist. I can clearly recognize I'm not an artist. I just understood that intuitively. I think upper left is Rudy Audio and his crazy pots, his terror. You know, the lifestyle and the sort of exuberance and the intelligence of these people just kept me excited about the possibility of art and the possibility of poetics. Based on some rational, obviously, delivery systems that they were all involved in. And upper right is the artist that probably had the biggest impact on my career, Harold Blaze, and the sculptures he built. And these were large scale sculptures. He built them in a shop of probably about 1,000 square feet. And with him, I learned how to manipulate material, how to fabricate material, how to work harder than I ever thought I could. And how to think smart in how you can manipulate ideas and actually watch those ideas being crafted and discover nuances during the art of crafting that work. That has led me, and again, later in my career, I'm further and further from this part where I'm on a construction site, and I can actually see how things are crafted and think about what is there in the way those parts and pieces and materials are being crafted, that maybe there's an idea that can actually evolve into even a more powerful idea or powerful architecture. Really important, I think, to my mid-career. This is the studio. I mean, again, it's just a workshop. It's a workshop of experimentation on all materials: concrete, steel, copper, glass, wood. He was not afraid of anything, and I learned not to be afraid of experimentation and failure and success. Finally, the last project, and I always refer to this, a little bittersweet here. This is my dad's boss when I was a kid, a guy named Royal McClure. This is a little cabin I grew up on, spent a lot of time in Coeur d'Alene. And honestly, if you look at this floor plan, and you all know how to read floor plans, and within like 300 square feet, there's only one enclosed space, the most private space, the bathroom, and / a little bit of storage. But everything is open to that landscape, and it's a shelter basically. And you can see just in these little moves, Royal understands virtually all the parts and pieces that are necessary to make a very, very beautiful, impactful architecture. Let's see, last time I was here is probably 1963 to 64. Last time I recall being here was 63 to 64. Something like 25 years later, I was on Coeur d'Alene. I could just sense that I was in the same place on this big lake. I had no idea where it was on the lake because, of course, I was too young to really know what part of the lake and where, what roads, and I was able to find it. It was almost like there was something almost not quite genetic, but something that drew me to the place, and I found it on the beach. It's since been replaced by a McMansion, but again, hugely important project for me because small things, and this is important to my career to date, is that small things are where things are researched and developed, and small things in big landscapes is what I think we are all trying to do. I hope that makes sense. So what I'd like to do is just start the roll. I think Heather's got some questions for me to start off, and anything that comes up that you want me to clarify, that you want me to add on to, don't hesitate to ask me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. I'm just starting to open up the Q&A queue, as it were. And certainly feel at this point that if you have questions you'd like to ask of Tom, go ahead.
I will say, one thing I will say, sorry, Heather, for the interruption. I will say, more or less, this role is chronological. So Studio House was the moment I felt in my career I was actually making architecture. But at that point, I've been so quote unquote an architect since since I was 24 years old. But I never felt, and we all know this, as stepping away from something we had done, maybe had some authorship to, where we really felt it was running on all cylinders. So what I wanted to do was start with Studio House and just follow through the career to date chronologically, and just show some projects as I matured from about 35 to now about 67.
Yeah, Tom, I mentioned to you before we got on that the Studio House was the first thing I had seen, and it really knocked me out. And I made sure at that point I watched everything you did from then on. Tell us a little bit about that client, because he came with some sensibilities that kind of matched yours, it seemed.
Well, yeah, so that's really an important question, Josh, because of course, students and young architects will ask me, well, how how did your life finally change? You know, when did it feel like you actually sort of, in a sense, the rubber hit the road, where you felt like, now I'm really working from a center, from a core, if that makes sense. Studio House for me was that project. And what I'll say is, it came along at the right time in my career. I have seen any number, it happens to everybody, where you just want it to come along at the right time. You want the right client, you want the right situation. If it comes too early, you can swing and miss, in a sense. The thing might be built. And there have been a few projects before Studio House where, if I go back and I think about it, I'm not sure it really is like a home run or something that really came from the core, really came from the center. And this was a client that actually, the conversation was so clear that as soon as we started talking, what they were looking for, what I was looking for, it just happened to mesh. So I was lucky again to be there at the right time. But when you get a situation like that, you get one chance, right? And so knew it was a moment in time. And by that point, I had carried so many ideas. After 10 years of doing architecture with other firms and friends and colleagues, you know, whatever, you know, so kind of immature, maybe misdirected, you learn from your mistakes. At some point, you really are building up a place where you can actually launch. And this was a client that said something really interesting at the end of the project. They said, you know, I love this place, but it is not anywhere near what I imagined it would be, which was kind of a cool thing, because this client was heavily involved in the process from day one to the end. And there was always support along the way. There were questions, there were tests, there was pushback, but there was always a sense of trust to follow that project through. Now, I was also working, there was an individual there with a little pork pie hat. That was David Galassa. He was a hell of a fabricator, a metal fabricator, and a really talented individual also. So he was involved. And then Janice Viekman, an interior designer who is really terrific to be working with, because she brought in her DNA. David brought in his DNA. I brought in my DNA, and the client brought in their DNA. And it was a conversation. And ultimately, as we all know, architecture is just the result, in a way, of a conversation between a bunch of individuals. The contractor was certainly terrific. The contractor was patient. The contractor was good, and they were excited about the project.
With this image right here, in this project right here, it's kind of what your work has reminded me of Glenn Murcutt's work, and I hope you consider that
Huge.
yeah, because I just love the man, like I love your work. So have you had a chance? I know that Glenn Murcutt was teaching up at University of Washington, and you're a product of University of Washington. Did you get a chance to meet him earlier in your career?
No, but later was able to meet him when he came to the University of Washington. And the real honor was he was actually aware of the stuff I was doing. And that kind of blew me away, because Glenn, you know, always, in fact, I was able to go with Glenn to the Wilson residence. And I remember when I walked in there, I turned around to Glenn and I said, well, here's the house that launched 1,000 derivatives. And I was, right? Everybody just looks at some of the Glenn's work, and man, it is just so impactfully inspiring that sometimes almost makes you a little nervous that maybe you're doing a little too much, you know, you're a little too influenced by Glenn and his fantastic work. But for him to say that he was aware of what I was doing, was an honor, frankly. And we were able to hang out with him in Australia and in the US.
Well, your work is derived, it really is grounded. And this image right here is a perfect example. The indoor to outdoor and the connection, it's like you kind of looked at Midwest, mid-century modernism and kind of made that final connection to the outside. And I love the way that your indoor materials go to the outdoors, and they really do have different feeling on both sides of that wall, but it's the same material.
And I'm glad you asked that question, Josh, because here's because my dad was an architect, right? And as I didn't really mention this, but those of you that might not know a little bit of my history, that was the reason I did not want to be an architect. I went to school to study physics and hard sciences, and I just wound up architecture because, of course, architecture is the intersection between the rational and the poetic, which is something I learned from Glenn, and it just makes perfect sense to me. So I came with some poetic background, and I was always interested in sort of the rational sciences. So growing up in the 50s and the 60s in particular, I was in a lot of mid-century homes and projects. And I remember vividly as a kid, and I was that kid that would rather be outside than inside, that the mid-century homes, for the most part, did not follow through on their promise. They didn't. There was like a big sheet of glass between me and the outside, or the outside and the inside. And it was, and if you think about the career with the gizmos and the things opening up, what I'm trying to do is actually break down that glass wall, in a sense, right, in that glass ceiling, glass wall, between the inside and the outside, because ultimately the outside is where personally, not everybody, but personally, I'd rather be outside than inside. So I really want to feel not only visually and kind of almost spiritually that outside and inside. I want to really I want to bring that outside to the inside, and then vice versa. So that it becomes kind of a transparent connection between the two. But inside is refuge and outside is exposure or risk or whatever you want to call it. And that's what a home, a shelter, is all about. A shelter or a home is about feeling protected, feeling safe. And so there's that interesting balance between the yin and yang of prospect and refuge, and yin and yang, that you're always, and I always will say the architecture is actually the thin line. That's what's so fascinating about what we get to do as architects. We actually get to draw that line between the inside and the outside. That's the magic line. That's the ecotone line of a shelter, is that line. And that's our realm in a way. And I find it completely fascinating. And I'm still been doing this now for many years. I'm still fascinated with that idea of refuge, that idea of prospect, and the balance between the two. And the mid-century home initially was really the first home, other than maybe you could argue there was some Asian architecture that would also embrace that, which I think is true. But the mid-century home for me was the one that got me interested in that idea of the outside was the inside and the inside was the outside. It just didn't follow through on the promise for me.
Right.
I have a couple questions. Oh, sorry, Josh.
No, it's fine. Go ahead. Good.
I have a few questions that are coming through here. Aaron asks, can you talk a bit about materiality in terms of developing an architecture that is congruent with its context versus juxtaposing it? Are there times
Yeah.
when both are appropriate? He asks. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I have in a way, you're absolutely right. There's got to be a relationship, and that relationship can be incongruous or congruous, and it depends on how it sort of fits in the scale and the material and the natural landscape beyond the building that you're working on. I think it's a really terrific question because it says there is no answer, there is no wrong answer, and there is no right answer, but the answer is how you develop that materiality between that place, both from inside to the line to outside. I hope I answered the question. That's a good question.
Aaron, let us know if you have a follow-up to that. Glenn asks, are you conscious of other architecture influencing your work and or requests from your clients?
Yeah, well, the requests from the clients, not so much, maybe, but other architects. It's an interesting question because I don't know if this is too, I don't mean this to be provocative, but I found it to be important for me that how you learn about other architects currently working can almost have, well, you got to just be careful about not being too derivative, if that makes sense. In other words, sometimes I'm kind of backing into an answer that I think is really important for us as a firm, because we're a firm that's trying to find something that maybe is a newer edge or a different way of thinking about things, innovative. You got to be careful with that word because I'm not sure, what innovation really means, if it's reinvention, but something that surprises you. And if you look at media too much, you start reacting to that rather than reacting in your own zone or your own situation. I don't know if this is totally making sense here, but where there are some architects working internationally and nationally that I just think are really interesting to watch, but I want to sort of understand what they're doing, but I don't want to be so deeply understanding what they're doing that actually that understanding begins influencing what I'm trying to do, which is trying to understand the idiosyncratic situation I'm working with, regardless of whether it's culture, context, client, contractor, or whatever. I want to learn from them, if this makes sense, but I don't want to be influenced stylistically. One thing I try to make clear with younger staff and students is that, think about it, if you're actually reading a magazine or watching a video or visiting a project, we're looking at something that is at least 5 years old, if that makes sense. So there's, and this is back to Josh's question about authenticity. If you're designing something stylistically without understanding the basis of it, you're using media as a source, you're actually designing something that is at least 5 years old, because you got the design process, you got the 2 years of construction and 2.5 years, and then it usually takes a couple of years, a year and a half before something gets published or wins awards or whatever. So in 5 years, that project is front and center in media, which is kind of interesting. You should be in another place thinking about another way of approaching a solution. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. How do you interact with your architectural photographer?
Oh boy, that's a really good question, because I do think I don't want, and I think there's some people here that might almost get frustrated with me when they ask me, well, which shots should I take, or what's a shot? And I usually will say, well, for the most part, aren't we hiring an artist or a thinker or a visual pro to go in there and tell the story? Why, I'm not a camera person. I'm not that great with a camera. I don't know really how a camera works or a video works, to really tell the impactful story. So I take a little bit of a back seat. honestly, Heather, the only thing that everybody around here knows that's important to me, I'd like to see elevational shots rather than three-quarter shots. Now, that doesn't mean that's all we do, but there's something about an elevational shot for me, whether it's interiors or whether it's exteriors, that speaks volumes to me about the story. And I don't know if it's because that's the frame of the photograph and it's, it's not all distorted or distortion. I don't know what it is, but for me personally, I do like the elevational shots. But what I don't want to do is art direct, if this makes sense, the photographer.
That does make sense. It's like the film directors who say, I cast actors who can act, right? I don't want to have to direct them too much.
That's the way I want to be treated by a client,
Right, right.
I had one client, sorry for the story here, but I love this story and it's an important one for me. A client interviewed me. It was really tough, a lot of hard questions. And finally, towards the end, he says, well, look, I actually don't like anything you've done to date, but I want to hire the brain that came up with those ideas. And I thought it was kind of fantastic. I said, well, that's exactly right, because it is a conversation. You do want to engage with a client and a contractor and everybody, because it is a conversation and you do want to carry it on and make something that maybe no one has ever seen or it's idiosyncratic to the situation. And that's the way I would treat any artist or craftsperson. If somebody comes along, well, of course I do drawings and craftspeople build it, but if they kind of modify it.
That's great. Get the right brain on the job. Steve asks, what has proved to be your most difficult project and why?
It's when clients don't trust you. Because basically, I think Frank Gehry even said that. Here is a lion of architecture and has won every single prize and there is out there. And I think he has some, and I'm really paraphrasing, this is not a quote, but he says what's interesting is that you get hired based on your history, but as soon as you're hired, the client has no faith in your ability and they question every one of your moves as a failure, from a negative critical standpoint. I don't mind the sort of critical discussions. I don't mind, polite, engaged concerns, of course, but at some point, what really is problematic is when there is and usually it's just the DNA doesn't match, and that's when you kind of sometimes will say to a client, I'm just probably not your architect, and that we have to figure out another architect that maybe has a clear conversation with you.
Thank you.
And it's value to them too, because if I'm struggling and they're struggling, it just can't be a good result.
Right. Mitchell says, curious about all your cool mechanisms. They look custom engineered. Do you generally work with consultants or are they in-house? How do contractors react to these?
Well, we're lucky. We're as lucky as anybody can be out there. We lucked out meeting Phil Turner, and Phil now is 84, 86 years old. He's got a mind like a teenager, but he doesn't have a body like a teenager. So he's living at home and he's communicating with us, Zooms and telephone. But I started working with him, he was probably 78 or 75. And growing up with Harold, watching how we made these big sculptures and moved these big heavy things using pulleys and levers. And I got to know the seven machines pretty well, screws, levers, ramps, whatever. And Harold was brilliant. about how to move things, unbalanced things that were really dangerous in the way to move. Well, Phil has taken that to another level, and don't want to bore you with his history, but when you work with, you come up with an idea. As an example, Chicken Point, that's the big window that opens up with the Savannah, who was 7 years old with a broken foot, lifting 6.5 tons of glass and steel in that video. That's like, maybe I kind of had an idea that, oh, you could do this. But I don't know how to get there. I don't know how to deliver it. And Phil knows how to deliver it. And from a fabrication, he's also a fabricator. So he can not only engineer it instinctively and intuitively, and numbers, a few numbers, but in particular, his instinct and his intuition. He also knows how to fabricate and assemble those pieces of machinery. So the contractors and the fabricators immediately recognize they're talking and working with somebody that really is a master at delivering these pieces of machinery.
Mm.
So, and we've seen others try and frankly fail relative to what Phil's able to do. These gizmos work like butter. They're low maintenance, they're smooth as silk, and they are useful.
That's great. This must be in response to one of the slides. Kay asks for more info about rolling huts.
Kay's looking for, but yeah, there's a lot of stories that, and here's something you're going to see, I hope. Here's something interesting for architects is that some of the bigger projects that we're getting now are based on extremely small projects. And the rolling huts is really important to this firm because we just finished on the Nike campus, the LeBron James Innovation Center, which is really where Nike innovates, shoes and athletic wear. And I asked Tinker Hatfield, why did they come to me? I mean, Nike could hire anybody. And they said, he immediately said, I didn't actually know who you were, but I saw this thing called the rolling huts. And I love the fact that within this little thing, you were able to make a magic thing that transcended a normal hut. And the reason they roll, and I think Nike being the provocateur in the athletic industry, wear industry, they love the DNA of that project, which is, of course, it's on wheels that don't really move that easily. They couldn't get a permit for 6 little huts on the piece of property. This is the same piece of property as a Delta shelter, a little tower house. And so we had to figure out, well, how are we going to be able to deliver these huts? Well, we found out that there was a permit for 14 recreational vehicles that could be parked on the site with the local planning and zoning. And of course, that if we put something on wheels, that's what the definition of an RV was. If it was on wheels, it was also a mobile home. And also the owner then didn't have to pay property taxes on the improvement of the property. So it was a moment in time. We had a client that was willing to take the risk, and had a million stories. But some of those are the overarching stories of the rolling huts. They're basically very gritty plywood tents with steel exteriors. They're pretty rough, but they're supposed to be. They're supposed to appeal to somebody that wants to camp, but maybe wants a little more security with a door.
Got it. The theme of the AIAW conference that's happening tomorrow and Thursday here is resiliency. And so a question has come through maybe from a member of that group that says, you mentioned many tons of glass and steel in your projects. Please speak about your notions of resiliency.
Well, that's a good question.
It is a good question.
Resiliency is about practical, rational design. And we all know, those of us that are involved in the technical delivery of projects, the more complex, the more the more complex the detailing, the formwork and whatever, the more all these, like in Wisconsin, of course, true 4 seasons climates, they work on the building and they basically break down the building over time. So what we try to do is the basis of the architecture is actually simple and like a shed, basically. If you look at a lot of the work, it's actually pretty simple. And then it can have stuff on it, like the gizmos or whatever. But everything is pretty darn straightforward. Everything is basically a linear solution until it gets to the corner. And as we all know, the corners and the edges, that's where the technical resilience really ramps up. And that's where we're really super careful on how they're all detailed. So all of the projects are carefully detailed, carefully understood. Generally, the materials on the outside are tough. So we always say tough, like a Tootsie Pop, tough on, hard on the outside, but soft on the inside. And that's also figures into resiliency. And of course, glass and steel, pretty resilient. In this image we're looking at, this is barnwood that's, already aged. And then of course the steel is also unpainted, so you don't have to repaint it. Let it just oxidize in the weather.
Yeah, you've got a few great slides that were illustrating this exactly as you were talking about it. Matt says, what is the future of architecture given climate volatility?
Of course, that's a really good question. I don't know what the future of architecture is, but the future of us as a species is really important. We just have to be this is a good example, this little hut. We really have to be kind of smart. Of course, a lot of the work we do is ground up work, but a lot of the work we're now doing and actively looking for is repurposed work of existing buildings and trying to keep that embodied energy already in place and raising the performance of that building, because climate change is a reality. It's not a joke. It's not a conspiracy. It is. We already are seeing it. In fact, some of my science friends years ago said it's not going to be global warming. It's going to be global weirding. And what they meant by that was our storms are going to be crazier, or sometimes we have 80-degree New York days in the middle of winter, and then we have snow in places no one ever expected snow, like Texas, and ice. I mean, they do get snow and ice, but really serious storms. And then highly energy focused hurricanes, tornadoes. So our role as architects is clearly to try to recognize what we do as an impactful consumptive industry is how do we reduce our footprint. And obviously not everything we do is successful, but we do try to be sensitive to that understanding. I don't know if I'm answering the question 100%, but it's the nature of nature. We have to recognize it.
Yes. This seems like a good one to go out on. The statement is, the paradigm of small things in big landscapes is poetic. Where do your initial thoughts on architecture go when you don't have the big landscape to start from?
Yeah, I think there's always a big landscape. This is Manhattan. That's a big landscape. That's a big context. You've got the culture, you've got the climate, you've got the history. That to me, that's landscape. And when people ask me about context, they say, well, you get to work in these big, rural, beautiful landscapes. No, that's not it. I mean, any place you work is a big context, is a big landscape. And Sure, you get to work in these fantastic urban centers like New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco. Those are fantastic. Well, that's not, I mean, this is a classic. That middle of the picture, that's a water tower. And we repurposed it into an apartment in the Upper East Side. I mean, these are kind of fantastic projects, but any landscape you work in fact, Heather is kind of, this is quite falling on that question 100%, but the repurposing of existing buildings into beautiful buildings, I believe, is the future of architecture. I don't know if people are taking us seriously, but I'm actually kind of excited when a really tough building to work with comes into the office and somebody says, well, we want to tear it down because it's so ugly or whatever, however somebody wants to describe it. And that actually gets me more excited because I think any building at its core is beautiful, because every building at its core is function driven. And our job is to try to just understand the previous builder, the previous architect, and try to make something and repurpose it into something very, very special. So hopefully that makes some sense.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. Well, let's hop back onto the screen here.
I can take a couple more questions, Heather, so if you got a couple.
I think we've reached the end.
Well, I do have a
Oh,
question for you.
Josh, of course.
I'm really, what are the design problems you're struggling with right now or this week, or you see, or things that you're excited about in projects that we'll be seeing in the future?
So a question I get asked a lot, Josh, is what's your favorite project? Because I've worked on so many projects in my career. And I have to say, my career is my favorite project. And that sounds like a kind of a cheap way out of answering the question, but I'm sincere. I think that's the most exciting part of my career and of all of our career is, can you imagine how lucky we are to get to work on these projects, regardless of their intent, if they're sort of low bar, high bar, whatever you want to call it. What an amazing opportunity to make better places out of the places we're living in right now. So that's what I'm most enthusiastic about. I have the same frustrations everybody else does running a business and owning a business. Not within the firm, because really we're so lucky on so many levels to just have this terrific group of people. And I couldn't be luckier again to have a terrific partnership to work with. But we have the same, client, misdirects, sort of demands, and financial issues. Those become emotionally tiring, I think, for all. But it's the nature. It's the nature of the business that you just want to balance really terrific things that we get to.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Jim Olson came out here years ago, did a wonderful presentation, and please say hi to him. And then in 2019, Kirsten Murray came out and did a wonderful presentation. So we're always interested in your firm's work.
Well, thank you. And I'm just looking, we're only at maybe halfway through the roll, so that's kind of exciting.
Wow.
And it actually was an indicator. It was actually an indicator that I talked too much at the beginning of the presentation.
No,
But yeah, we're working on so many. We're working literally around the world. We're working in China, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, the UK, Switzerland, Austria, India. Wow. I think the only continent we're not working on is Antarctica and Africa. Not for doing anything in Africa, but couldn't be happier. A little bit exhausting, kind of wish this happened when I was younger, when I was a little more, but really, really excited about stuff.
You have time for one more?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Are you a fan of reusing shipping containers?
Yeah, no, not really. And I'm saying that, unfortunately, not really, because we have worked on them and we found them to be, I mean, there's so many of them, you just want to use them. It's just like, oh my God, there's all this terrific energy to reuse. And I won't say, here's where I struggle with containers, is to make them actual living places. If they are storage units or temporary housing units or whatever, they actually do make some sense. But printing basically what is the least expensive part of a building, which is the skin of a building, and then taking what doesn't have any windows and any doors really, except for some, large doors at the end, and then putting in the usual stuff that you put into a house. I don't find it particularly rational, if that makes sense. I wish there was a use for them that was more rational to the investment in the embodied energy. There are some work with a contractor up in British Columbia that actually has turned them into really cool cabins and personal cabins and construction offices. And they're beautiful. They're stacked and they're neat, but they're really basically kind of unheated structures with cool windows and cool proportions. But they're not really, they're livable in a way, but not really livable as a house. And again, I wish they could be.
Mm-hmm. We had one more squeak in, so we can make this the last one if you like.
That's fine.
Peter asked, please share about some of your challenges growing from a firm of 7 to 260. It's a good question.
Oh, well, Peter, I'm glad you asked that question, because there are challenges and I'm dealing with those challenges as we speak. And when I presented a little bit about background, I said I was an old school architect, in the sense that I grew up thinking and knowing that an architect did everything from the scribbles to of the concept, working with a client, whatever, and understanding codes and understanding technical issues, tectonic issues, and solving them slowly through SDs, DDs, and then CDs, which are actually the instruction book to how to make this thing, and then construction administration, which is the politics of delivering this project with all sorts of personalities involved, beyond just the client, but also and talking about a lot more sort of investment and well, now when you're and there's a side issue here also. We actively look for small projects to date, because we still think the huts, like the rolling hut kind of project, or the small mountain hut, or the beach cabin, super important for me. My sort of DNA of wanting to follow a project, literally hand hold a project from beginning to end. That's super important. But when you start getting involved in some of these larger projects, or you're running a larger firm and you're working on, I don't even want to, I hesitate to even guess how many projects I'm sort of responsible for in the firm. Yes, I'm probably more skilled now than I was, certainly as a young architect, to immediately recognize a plan issue or a technical issue or whatever, and read drawings quicker than I ever could. But I still would rather be involved in not only recognizing that issue, but then actually actively exploring that issue. Because I can come up with a quick answer to answer that question based on my background, but to explore an answer is sometimes just simply that, is to draw through the question. And that you just start running out of time when you're dealing with a larger firm and larger projects, and which are cool, which are terrific, because large projects involve small things, so you can draw through small things and still have a huge impact on a large project. But that's probably, it's both a challenge and of course it's an opportunity on so many levels. You can impact more lives, more families here in the office, and more cultural agendas out there worldwide.
Thank you. Well, Tom, I want to thank you for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. I say tonight, and I know it's 2 hours earlier there in Seattle. You're on the verge of tonight. But thank you so much. Folks, listen up. We are releasing a communications tomorrow about the next Wright Design Series lecture, which is coming up very quickly, a week from tonight on May 3rd. At 7 p.m. Central Time. Our speaker, as Josh alluded to earlier, is Australian architect Peter Stutchberry. We're very excited about it. Make sure you look in your email, or your email inbox, or go to our website, mononaterrace.com, and go to the Wright Design Series page. There's information there, including that registration link. It will be a strictly virtual lecture, and how exciting to have two of these architects only a week apart. It's an embarrassment of riches, to be sure. So
yeah, Peter's a great guy. Incidentally, this project this is a 1962 office building repurposed into condominiums, and that's exactly what I'm saying. That I think that's the future, is to find these buildings and repurpose them into something really
great.
Project.
Josh, thanks so much to AIA Wisconsin. Any last words from you?
Well, thank you, Tom. We really appreciated your work and can't wait to see everything that you do for the many years to come. It's you've got friends out in Wisconsin, and please come out and visit us at any time. Any time of the year, we'll find something for you to do that'll be fun.
Well, we're actually doing about a 500 square foot hut just above Lake Superior outside on
Brilliant.
Yeah, so that's exact. Thanks for reminding me, Josh. Well, working on it right now. It's under construction, and couldn't be more excited about it.
That's wonderful.
Audience, thank you for joining us tonight. And remember, we have our next lecture coming up in a week on Tuesday, May 3rd at 7 p.m. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.